Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 155, Boy Actors, a conversation with Roberta Barker. In the third part of this series of guest episodes, before we get back to continuing the journey through the Shakespeare and Jonson canon, we're going deep into the world of the Renaissance period boy actors, or perhaps, as they should more properly be called, apprentice players. The habit of the period of young actors playing female roles is well known, but when I had a chance to talk with Roberta Barker about her study of apprentice players, it soon became clear that there is a lot more to their position in the playing company than that, and we get to meet some of them as personalities in their own right. Roberta Barker is a member of the joint faculty of King's College London, where she is Professor of Theatre, teaching in the Foundation Year and Early Modern Studies programmes, and Dalhousie University, Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she teaches theatre in the Fountain School of Performing Arts. Her research interests centre upon the relationship between performance and the social construction of identity, and has explored such topics as the representation of gender and class in the early modern tragedy, the early modern careers and modern afterlives of Shakespeare's boy actors, and most recently, the role played by the performance of illness in the 19th century stage in the evolution of realist style. She's also a theatre and opera director. I spoke to Roberta over Zoom from her home in Halifax and started by asking her what records we had for the very earliest boy actors.
Well, I think that, in fact, if we don't know for certain who the earliest boy actors were. And I think probably that if we went far back into the medieval theatre, we would find boys acting. That this seems pretty likely to have been a part of theatrical practice quite broadly in Europe, not just in England, for hundreds of years, sometimes with mixtures. And of course, it goes back into the ancient world if we think of the all-male companies that played in the ancient world. So it's not something that's specific. It's not a practice that's specific to the early modern period, the Renaissance in England. But rather, I think what it is something that's rooted and that becomes really deeply rooted once we get into the professional theatre, the rise of the professional theatre in England, in business practices, in guild practices, in the way that work, professional work, as we might now call it, functioned much more broadly in England in that period, especially through the guilds. So the practice of apprenticeship as the mode by which a young person, generally a young man, not always, but generally a young man, became tied to a master, was trained over a number of years, gained skills, this process that some scholars of early modern boy actors now call enskillment, how they're gaining the tools and the skills that they need to be a professional actor, and then graduate onwards to be an adult actor. These are very parallel to the ways that young men become goldsmiths or become grocers or become merchant tailors, all become part of all of these practices. So that as the theatre becomes professionalized in early modern England, so too this practice of apprenticeship becomes deeply embedded in how the English theatre works.
And I know from previous episodes that I've talked about how the practice of having boys playing the female roles wasn't actually something that was, as far as we know, there was no legislation against that, but it was certainly a deeply held custom and practice, probably originating in religion rather than anything else. So we do end up with this being a particular feature of the English theatre, that boy actors played female parts.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's fascinating there, as you say, it's not a law, it's custom. Many people first encounter this, in the last few generations, from Shakespeare in Love, for example, and the moment where Gwyneth Paltrow's character Shakespeare in Love says, "Oh, the law of the land has women played by pipsqueak boys in petticoats." In fact, not true, as you say. Much more rooted in custom and practice. and it's custom and practice that's different from a lot of the theaters on the continent, as you've talked about, for example, in Italy and in Spain, where we have in Italy the divas, these famous female identified actresses like Isabella Andreini. I think it's very interesting to note that another place where we do have, it appears, pretty dominantly male identified cast is in the Netherlands in this period. So what it seems to be, very broadly speaking, and this is a huge kind of broad brush statement, and what's going on gender wise in the European theater in this period is very complicated. Because in some theaters, like in France, we actually have both women and men playing female roles in this period. But what it seems to be very broadly is that the Protestant nations are more likely to feel that it's inappropriate to have women on the professional stage than the Catholic nations are.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that seems totally interesting to me, whether it has to do with the kind of rootedness of a lot of Protestant theology in the letters of St. Paul and in those statements like, I allow not that a woman speak in church and so on, this idea of it being inappropriate for women to kind of display themselves. Mm-hmm. Or whether there's more anxiety in the Roman Catholic world about young men dressing in women's clothing, what's identified as women's clothing. Of course, it's the Roman Catholic world that gives rise to the castrati, who will become another one of the great kind of symbols of gender crossing and gender nonconformity, we might say, in the world of performance history. So it's a really complicated history around religion, gender, and performance in the early modern period. But I do think it's that Protestant-Catholic divide that seems to be feeding most of all into what becomes, as you say, quite a distinctively English practice, but one that they do share, for instance, with the Netherlands.
That's a really, really interesting thought about the Catholic side of this.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of not what you expect for the, from our standpoint, hundreds of years later. I think it's become quite entrenched to think of it as the more progressive position to allow women onto the stage earlier, right? And that's not always what one associates with the Roman Catholic Church in the age of the Counter-Reformation, but it is the case that it's in the Catholic countries, for example, in Spain, where the Roman Catholic Church and the theaters have quite an intimate relationship.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So focusing back onto England, when do we really start to get information about boy actors and characters that we might identify as particular people? Yes.
I would say it's really we have some information flowing in the 1570s and 80s, but it's in particular in the 1590s where we start to see, for example, the names of particular actors who we think are young at the time, mm-hmm. Who are in their apprentice period, appearing, for example, in plots of plays. There's a famous and sort of much debated in terms of its date plot for a play called The Seven Deadly Sins, where we have numerous female roles with particular names attached to them of particular actors. So that, and different scholars have different views about exactly who those people are. But I, for example, tend to the argument of David Cathman, who sees that plot as coming from the late 1590s and coming from the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the company that would become the King's Men, and that you can actually see the names there of actors who are going to go on to become longtime members of that company. People like Nicholas Tooley, Robert Goff, people whose names appear in the Shakespeare First Folio, who we see there attached to female roles, for instance.
And is that the main source of information that we have from the printed play scripts where they're mentioned? What else have you been able to discover?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So I think the way that we sort of reason out who was an apprentice actor at what time, or who was a boy actor appearing in the children's companies. Because, of course, when we go into the 1590s in particular, and the early 17th century, we have two strands of young players who are playing in the English theatre, and that is the boys who are apprenticed to adult actors in the adult companies, and also the boys who are appearing in the children's companies, the all boy companies. In some cases, we have play scripts or plots. The Seven Deadly Sins, for example, is a manuscript plot, so it's not even printed, but we have a kind of notes, so to speak, about casting. So that's one of our sources. But we also have places where we know from later, for example, from letters or from other kinds of description, that that such and such an actor was a member of this company and was previously a member of this company. Sometimes we have much later sources, like James Wright's Historia Histrionica, written in the English Restoration, where he looks back on the pre-Civil War English theatre, and he has what it appears to be is that he's spoken to people who saw the stage in those days. He knows some of the actors who used to be apprenticed in the English theatre. And in some cases, he'll say, well, this person was apprenticed to this person. So we have that kind of evidence. And then some of the, another wonderful source of evidence we have is wills. We have the wills of a lot of actors and other people associated with the early modern theatre who will often leave money to people with whom they had a professional relationship and a very personal relationship. So, for example, we see people who are the masters saying, I leave to my apprentice, and it's often clothing, musical instruments, props, my sword. We see that, and we also see people who had been apprentices leaving money to or items to their master, the person who had been their master, or members of their master's family. So we actually see this kind of very close personal relationship that helped to shape the early modern companies coming out in the wills. And from those wills, we can say, oh, okay, well, this person was the apprentice of this person. And they had this relationship, which suggests that they were probably playing, the one who was the apprentice was probably playing female roles around this particular time. Because we do have a lot of evidence, and this is the last source that I'll want to flag, and this has been particularly amazingly researched by David Kathman in a series of articles about really the ages of the boy actors. For some of them, we have apprenticeship papers. We actually have indentures, and we have the binding of young men to their masters who we know to have been actors. And so in some cases, we can actually see how old they were when they were bound, how old they were when they were freed by their master and became a free man of that particular guild. And so that's another way that we're able to say, oh, okay, so this person was acting at this time. Finally, we do have some fantastic descriptions of particular performances, sometimes in payments. So for instance, we have payments made to particular masters for his boy who he trained to do this thing, for example, at a civic pageant or at a masque. And in some cases, we also can literally tie particular boys' names to particular roles because they appear in descriptions.
Amazing sense of continuity then from master to apprentice going through the period.
Yes.
But there isn't a sense of, there isn't a guild of players.
No,
at the time.
No, that's right. Exactly. And this is one of the things that leads to a kind of very interesting inconsistency in the records. Many actors belong to particular guilds. So, for example, John Hemmings belongs to the grocers, the Guild of Grocers. And one of his apprentices, Alexander Cook, I was just looking at this document in the National Archives in Kew a few weeks ago. When he's dying, quite young, in 1613, 14, he writes with his own hand, quite unusually, his will. And one of the things he says in it is, I ask my master Hemmings and Mr. Condell, so another member of the King's Men, and another man to take these funds for God's cause, and he puts it in brackets, for God's cause, to Grocers' Hall, to put it, to have it in trust for my poor orphans, because he has all these children, who are about to be, left behind with their mother orphaned. And so this idea that he feels clearly quite tied to Grocers' Hall by the fact that his master was a grocer. And as far as we can tell, Alexander Cook certainly, grew up as a boy in the King's Men, became quite a successful leading adult actor in The King's Men and died in the company. So he doesn't seem to have ever been a grocer, but his master was a member of the Grocers' Company, and so he was a member of the Grocers' Company. But there are other players, and the most famous example here is Richard Burbage, who we know had apprentices because of evidence coming out of things like wills. But we don't have any papers for them. For whatever reason that is, whether those papers just haven't survived. Burbage was linked to the Joiners' Company, which his father also belonged to. But none of the people we think were his apprentices, and one of them, Nicholas Tooley, actually refers to Burbage in his will as my late master, Richard Burbage, ever seemed to allude to this company. So some of them seem to have had close ties to companies that didn't have anything to do with playing. Others of them, perhaps less so. But there is no Players Guild because it's not sort of recognized in a sense as a legitimate professional occupation. It's still very borderline, as we know, in terms of its respectability. Yeah.
It's not really possible to say whether the attachment to a guild was something that everyone always had to maintain, even if they weren't strictly part of that trade. I'm reminded of Ben Jonson, retaining his Bricklayers Guild membership for all those years, even though he was clearly making his money from his writing. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that is a really common practice among early modern actors, is this tie to professional organizations that gives you a kind of respectability and part of a structure, and that it's clear that you are a citizen and that you're a respectable citizen. And yet at the same time, these are people who are making, in many cases, large fortunes in this apparently disreputable profession of the professional player, and who, of course, end up having ties. And this is another thing we can see in the life arcs of some people who start out as boy actors and who, as one document put it, were bred up from children in the king's service. That from their childhood, they're bred to be the members of the King's Men. They're bred to be the king's players, and as they grow up, they have friends among the aristocracy. They or certainly acquaintances. So they have a network that's tremendously exalted, and yet they also belong to this very borderline kind of profession.
Yes, that always sounds rather, I don't know, something slightly dodgy about being brought up as one of the... But it could have been a very nice life for someone who would otherwise maybe have been on the streets. Who knows? Yes. I mean, I think that's a very interesting question about exactly who they were. So we know that some of the young men, and they're probably about 13 when they come into a company like the King's Men. They're 13 or 14, so they're older than we sometimes think of them as being. Because they've come to be known as boy actors. Right. But it seems that within the adult companies, they were generally in their teens when they were playing women's roles. And some of them come out of the children's companies. They're kind of cherry-picked out of the children's companies, that the adult players kind of go and see the children's companies. They're like, oh, that's okay. Let's see if we can get that one. But others seem to come out of, merchants' families. A lot of them, I think, have been to grammar school, for example. They're expected, I think, one of the skills they're very likely to be expected to have when they come into an adult company is they're going to have to be literate, Because they need to read their scripts and learn them and be dexterous with words. Yeah. Exactly. They're going to have to hit the ground running, largely, in terms of some of those skills. And so, again, they probably largely come from reasonably respectable kind of citizen families into this strangely borderline profession. And I think it's a really fascinating question what their lives were like. And we're just really beginning to learn a little bit more about, and really in some ways to look again at documents that we've known about for a long time, to think perhaps in the light of all kinds of questions that are very present in the minds of the current generations, like gender, the relationships to gender, relationships to sexuality, and so on. What these documents have to tell us about what these young men's lives were like as they were playing women's roles. You mentioned briefly there already that they would start playing female roles, younger roles. Do we have a good sense of how that progression worked, or was it a question of, well, it depended who your master was and what roles they were playing? That's a great question. I mean, for some of the boy actors, we do have quite a bit of evidence. But often it's evidence, so to be able to really say kind of progressively,
Did they start playing very tiny roles and grow upwards towards very large women's roles? And then, and this appears to be the arc for most of the people that we can trace evidence through about, that they're trained playing women's roles. And when they're in that the apprenticeship, that is predominantly what they are playing. And that it seems likely that some of these very large and impressive roles that are written for women, and we think of some of the very famous examples from, for example, Shakespeare, like Cleopatra, a massive role, or Rosalind in As You Like It, a large role. These are roles that can kind of stand alongside the men's roles. And it's certainly the case, and it's one of the ways we can tell that these were kind of training roles, that if we compare the size of women's roles in the English theater, on average, to the size of women's roles in the Spanish theater, for example, they're not as large. So the Spanish actresses, these roles that are being played by adult women, there's more larger roles than there are in the English theater. So we can kind of see that these are kind of training roles in a certain way in the English theater, but some of them are huge. And these seem to be the roles that you would give to someone as they're at the sort of the peak of their training. They're reaching their adult master status, and they're going to play some of these wonderful showpiece roles. Webster's Duchess of Malfi is another great example, a title role. And then it seems that perhaps after that, they're sort of journeyman actors within the company, and perhaps they're playing smaller men's roles after that for a while. And we can certainly see that in many cases, it takes them a while after they've been an apprentice to become a sharer in a company, for example. And some of them never become a sharer in a company. But some of them do become sharers quite quickly, and some of them, rise up to then have these kind of leading roles within the company. And this is something we can see, for example, in the instance of Alexander Cook, an actor that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that we can kind of see him in cast lists sort of rising to be quite high up in the lists of people playing adult men's roles. So my sense of it is that in a sense we can think of the women's roles, and this is a very strange way for us to think of it now, when we imagine these as roles that are coveted by actors of various gender identifications. But then in a sense, these women's roles are viewed, among other things, as the roles in which you learn the emotional scope and all the different kinds of, how to play tragedy, how to play comedy, how to play class, how to play working class, how to play merchant class, how to play an aristocrat, how to play a queen, and then, how to wear your clothes, how to dance, how to sword fight. All of these things can actually be built into these women's roles. And in some of the really peak ones, you're able to show off all of your range and give this sort of sense that you're going to be able to take those skills with you into men's roles, which are viewed as the adult roles.
So it makes me think that if an actor left for whatever reason, but if one died suddenly, that left a huge gap in the troupe.
Oh, huge. And this is one of the things that we can sometimes actually see a company like the King's Men having to navigate, because they invest. The apprentices are undoubtedly huge investments for them. And sometimes those investments pay off tremendously. So we see people like, for example, an actor that I've done a lot of work on, Richard Robinson, who seems to have started as an apprentice in the King's Men in the sometime in the sort of mid to late 1600s. And by the time we get to 1611, 1612 in there, we can actually see him playing prominent women's roles, for example, in Middleton's play known as The Second Maiden's Tragedy or The Lady's Tragedy. We actually have a stage direction in the manuscript for that play, Enter Lady Rich Robinson. So we know that he played that role. And a lot of people, myself included, think that he was probably the first Duchess of Malfi in Webster's Duchess of Malfi. And then he goes on and he spends his entire rest of his career in the King's Men. He's one of the people that we can make a very good guess was Richard Burbage's apprentice, because he's in the room when Burbage is dying. He signs Burbage's will, and he marries Burbage's widow, Winifred Burbage. So he becomes as one company member says, Mr. Robinson, in the right of his wife, owns all of these shares in the company, and And he becomes an adult player in the company, and so on. So he's a great example of someone who they invested in, and literally in the debate around these shares, the Burbages come back at the people who are saying, like, why does he have all these shares? And say, well, these guys weren't brought up from children in the king's service, and he was. So, shut up. But on the other hand, you do have moments where, for example, apprentices leave the company, they go on and do something different, or they die. And it certainly seems that we can see moments where somebody in whom they had invested a lot suddenly dies. They had a terrible period around sort of 13, 14, around the time of the death of Alexander Cook. They also lose, in the Kingsmen, two more of the kind of potential leading men that they had been counting on. And you see them having to scramble. And sometimes this happens with the apprentices as well, that someone will die or someone will leave or someone will have sort of a scandal. Things will go badly and they'll have to scramble to get new boys in. And so I think it is very much deeply about succession planning in the companies. As you said, they see it, I think, as a long arc in terms of, and how when you're growing a company, you don't just have to have leading actors, but you also have to have people who are going to be great supporting actors,
right?
Who are going to have particular specialties. So some, for example, going back to an earlier question that you have, we can certainly see that sometimes it appears that certain specialties of masters get handed on to their apprentices. So, for example, John Shank, who comes into the King's Men as a clown, as a comic actor, his apprentice, Thomas Pollard, becomes the leading comic actor of the King's Men in the late part of its history, in the 1630s, for example. And Pollard, I think, is a much greater comic actor than his master was. But you can see that he's kind of working with some of the skills that he learned, perhaps even when he was playing female roles.
So great sense of the arc from talent spotting right through to building up people, young actors into big parts. Is there a sense of actors never retiring and dying on stage, or is there an exit strategy for
that's a great question.
A Jacobean actor?
We certainly do seem to see that quite a lot of them do eventually retire. They start disappearing from the cast lists. But there are others, and of course, a lot of people die. I mean, the person who we know pretty much goes out with his boots on is Richard Burbage. He dies very suddenly.
Yes.
His will is non-cupative. It appears that he's kind of lying there on his deathbed, and he's got his brother, his brother's wife, and his two. These are the two people that I've spent a lot of time with. Someone who appears to have been his apprentice in the 1590s, Nicholas Tooley, and Richard Robinson, who appears to have been his apprentice around sort of 1610-ish on either side of that. They're there in the room when he dies, or when he's dying at least, and they sign this non-cupative will. And you can tell that the King's Men absolutely is in quite a panic, and there's elegies to Burbage that mention, the poor company is freaking out. What are they going to do? Because he was their star. And so he, for example, definitely goes out with his boots on, and he's in his early 50s at that time. But others do seem to retire. And then, of course, one of the fascinating things we can see is what happens to some of the actors as the theaters close down in the 1640s. And we can see some of them, for example, living together. I found a record recently, or I was looking at a record recently, I'm sure others have seen it before as well, where you can see Burbage's son, William Burbage, Richard Robinson, who's his stepfather, and Thomas Pollard, who I just mentioned, another member of the company, the great comic actor, all living very close together in the Blackfriars, near the theater, the Blackfriars Theater, in the Burbage properties, in around 1645, during the period of the closure of the theaters, as if they're kind of sticking together in the property that they've got left,
hunkered down somewhere.
That's right, and it's in that parish that Richard Robinson dies, and we have a record for him of his burial in St. Anne's Blackfriars that reads Richard Robinson, a player. So even in death, he's very identified with that profession in which he began as such a young, a teenager playing women's roles. Spoiler alert, springing forward to where you're going to be going. I could just maybe say a few words about some of the fascinating kind of sources we have about the lives of boy actors or apprentice actors and their diversity outside of the theater. Because I think one of the things about discussion about these actors is sometimes it'll be spoken of very broadly. You know, why did boys play women? But if we think about actors today, we know how diverse they are and what different personalities they have and different relationships to their roles. And so the example that I mentioned of the two apprentices of Richard Burbage that we know of, Nicholas Tooley and Richard Robinson, something that's wonderful about these two actors and that I've been doing a lot of work with is the fact that we do have these remarkable pieces of evidence about their lives outside of the theater. In the case of Tooley, it's a record that appears in the casebooks of Simon Foreman, who's an astrologer and kind of quack doctor, and of course, someone who is beloved or hated among scholars of the early modern theater and students of the early modern theater for being one of the few eyewitnesses of an early Shakespeare production or numerous early Shakespeare productions, who doesn't necessarily talk about the things we want him to talk about. Yes. But we have a few records in Foreman's casebook from 1599 where he describes a patient coming to him, Nicholas Tooley of 17 years, and he talks about what this young man, just at exactly the point in his life when he would have been playing women's roles. And interestingly, you know, if we think about this, this is around the period where Shakespeare's writing a role like Ophelia, for instance. So this is quite interesting, I think. Yeah. And the record says, here's what he's suffering from melancholy and cold phlegm. He is fearful and timorous, much gnawing in his stomach, stuffing in his lung, a certain faintness withal, and a rising up in his throat, ready to stop his wind. So this sort of sense like this poor young man is really in bad shape when he goes to see Foreman.
Sounds terrible.
It does. And it sounds, among other things, I mean, one way of reading it is that it sounds like it's possibly, you know, it starts, he's fearful and timorous. Anxiety, you know, this sort of tremendous like panic attacks, as we might now talk about them. And of course, Foreman sees this in terms of humoral imbalance. But I think it's really interesting because around this time, we do see one of the things that happens in Shakespeare's writing around this time, and I wouldn't say this was completely due to Tooley, but it might have an interesting relationship, is he writes a lot of roles of women who are ill or melancholy or, you know, sort of Doll Tearsheet who walks into Henry IV, Part 2, throwing up. You know, it's quite an interesting potential link. Whereas in the case of Richard Robinson, what we have for him, and this links into Jonson, who you've been discussing, Jonson writes a speech about Robinson in his play The Devil is an Ass, kind of gratuitously in the middle of this play. There's a discussion about we need someone to impersonate a woman, and one of the characters says, well, you should get one of the players. For example, there's Dick Robinson, a very pretty fellow, and comes often to a gentleman's chamber, a friend of mine. And he goes on to describe how this friend once took Robinson, dressed like a lawyer's wife, to a feast of merchant class ladies, or like sort of lawyers' wives, a gossip's feast. And Robinson passes as a woman at this dinner party of women. And he says, you know, to see him behave it and lay the law and carve and drink unto him and talk body and send frolic. So here he is here's Robinson having a great time as a woman among women. And he says, one of the other characters says, oh, they say he's an ingenious youth. Oh, sir, and dresses himself the best, beyond 40 of your very ladies, or 40 of your very ladies, you know, so he's better at dressing himself. He's a better woman than real women, very ladies, and especially real upper class women, ladies. So one of the things I love about, we know these are two people who knew each other really well. In his will, Tooley actually specifies very specifically 29 pounds, 13 shillings and a certain number of pence that Robinson owed him when he died, and that he wants to be given to Sarah Burbage, the posthumous daughter of their master, Richard Burbage. So they knew each other, and yet they come across as such different personalities. These two people who were trained in the same way, in the same company, probably played a lot of the same roles, but you get this sense of, on the one hand, kind of the suffering and ill health that Tully goes through as a young man versus this kind of picture of Robinson as this kind of joyous party figure appearing at parties of women dressed, passing as a woman.
Yeah.
And so this is what fascinates me, this sense that actually these actors, as they were going through their careers, had their own very distinct personalities as performers, that these personalities undoubtedly informed the roles that were written for them, and that we can see the diversity of their relationships to things like gender and sexuality, as well as to performance.
Does that master-apprentice relationship carry on after the Restoration?
Great question. So we don't see that same structure, that kind of, I think we do see more informally in the Restoration that those sort of processes of training through some people coming in their youth, and certainly younger actors being taken up by older actors, that certainly continues. But I don't think that we see that same highly structured. The theater in the Restoration becomes a theater whose professional nature starts to look more like that of what will become the modern theater.
Right.
Then the English Renaissance theater with its deep roots in the guilds. And I think there's a real involvement of that in the appearance of female identified actors, women actors in the Restoration. They definitely don't come up through, guild relationships and apprenticeship relationships. They come into the theater in quite different ways. I mean, sort of famously and often out of very difficult situations.
Yeah.
Nell Gwynn selling oranges in the theater, for example, famously. Those kind of formal and in a way protective relationships, although I'm sure that a lot of the apprentices were put in very dodgy situations, but those drop out. But one thing that I will say, that we can see in a work like Historia Histrionica, for example, is the fact that we see some of the relationships from the early modern, the pre-war theater, the Shakespearean era theater and Fletcherian era theater and Johnsonian era theater, passing into the tradition of the English theater in the Restoration. And one line in Historia Histrionica that's very interesting is describes Charles Hart, who was one of the leading actors of the Restoration, and who played some of the, for example, leading Shakespearean roles in the Restoration. Says Hart was bred up as boy at the Blackfriars and acted women's parts. Hart was Robinson's boy or apprentice. So one way of reading that, and there's confusion about the name Robinson actually appears for numerous actors. So he could be describing any one of a number of actors. But one way of reading this is that basically there you see how the line from Richard Burbage to Richard Robinson to Charles Hart actually carries a tradition of playing through an apprenticeship relationship, through from the age of Shakespeare all the way through to the 1660s, 1670s in the Restoration theater. So I think that's a very interesting line of passage of this apprenticeship relationship that passes on a tradition.
And to finish up, I asked Roberta about the current work that she's engaged in.
Thanks for asking. So a lot of this work that I'm doing comes from my big project at the moment is to write a biography of a sort of life and times of Richard Robinson, this actor who, in a way, stands at the pivot of the history of the early modern theater. He's not a star player, except maybe briefly when he's playing women's roles. But he is someone who knew all the first generation, as an apprentice of Burbage, and someone who knew Shakespeare and created Shakespeare's roles for Shakespeare and appears in the first folio, and someone who was there at the very end who, as I say, dies right before King Charles I, during the period of the closure of the theaters. And so I'm working on a project that looks at his roles and his repertoire, but also the idea of an actor's life as a prism through which we can see the rise and fall of the early modern English theater, we might say, and the way it functioned and the way that it related to broader society in this period of great upheaval. And I'm also working at the moment on a new edition of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure for the Cambridge Shakespeare edition. And that's been a really wonderful opportunity also to look at this relationship relationship between the history of acting and the history of the creation of dramatic texts.
My thanks to Roberta for taking the time to talk to me and for bringing some of the apprentice players to life for us. If you haven't already done so, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram, Blue Sky or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.